Hello, I'm John Hartnett, a sort of retired Episcopal priest, and this is the next of my weekly reflections on some of the lessons appointed by the lectionary for the coming weekend. Now, today I'm looking at the story of David and Bathsheba, which the lectionary divided over 2 different weeks. And because it really does go together as a unit, I'm going to treat them both together. Last week's lesson and this week's, and I'm going to include the part in the middle that the lectionary skips over. So the reading's going to take longer than usual. It's going to take about 7 minutes and 30 seconds, plus or minus. So settle in for story time, and then we'll get into the reflection on the story after we finish the reading. Well, we'll begin with the lesson from the second book of Samuel, beginning at chapter 11, verse 1. In the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle, David sent Joab with his officers and all Israel with him. They ravaged the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained at Jerusalem. It happened late one afternoon when David rose from his couch and was walking about on the roof of the king's house that he saw from the roof a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful. David sent someone to inquire about the woman. It was reported, "This is Bathsheba, daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite." So David sent messengers to get her, and she came to him, and he lay with her. Now she was purifying herself after her period. Then she returned to her house. The woman conceived, and she sent and told David, "I am pregnant." So David sent word to Joab, "Send me Uriah the Hittite." And Joab sent Uriah to David. When Uriah came to him, David asked how Joab and the people fared and how the war was going. Then David said to Uriah, "Go down to your house and wash your feet." Uriah went out of the king's house, and there followed him a present from the king. But Uriah slept at the entrance of the king's house with all the servants of his lord, and did not go down to his house. When they told David Uriah did not go down to his house, David said to Uriah, "You have just come from a journey. Why did you not go down to your house?" Uriah said to David, "The ark and Israel and Judah remain in booths, and my lord Joab and his servants of my lord are camping in the open field. Shall I then go to my house to eat and to drink and to lie with my wife? As you live and as your soul lives, I will not do such a thing." Then David said to Uriah, "Remain here today also, and tomorrow I will send you back." So Uriah remained in Jerusalem that day. On the next day, David invited him to eat and drink in his presence and made him drunk. And in the evening he went out to lie on his couch with the servants of his lord, but he did not go down to his house. In the morning David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it by the hand of Uriah. In the letter he wrote, "Set Uriah in the forefront of the hardest fighting, and then draw back from him, so that he may be struck down and die." As Joab was besieging the city, he assigned Uriah to the place where he knew there were valiant warriors. The men of the city came out and fought with Joab, and some of the servants of David among the people fell. Uriah the Hittite was killed as well. Then Joab sent and told David all the news about the fighting. And he instructed the messenger, "When you have finished telling the king all the news about the fighting, then, if the king's anger rises, and if he says to you, 'Why did you go so near the city to fight? Did you not know they would shoot from the wall? Who killed Abimelech, son of Jerubbaal? Did not a woman throw an upper millstone on him from the wall so that he died at Thebez? Why did you go so near the wall?' Then you shall say, 'Your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead too.'" So the messenger went and came and told David all that Joab had sent him to tell. The messenger said to David, "The men gained an advantage over us and came out against us in the field, but we drove them back to the entrance of the gate. Then the archers shot at your servants from the wall. Some of the king's servants are dead, and your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead also." David said to the messenger, "Thus you shall say to Joab, 'Do not let this matter trouble you, for the sword devours now one and now another. Press your attack on the city and overthrow it,' and encourage him." When the wife of Uriah heard that her husband was dead, she made lamentation for him. When the mourning was over, David sent and brought her to his house, and she became his wife and bore him a son. But the thing that David had done displeased the Lord, and the Lord sent Nathan to David. He came to him and said to him, "There were 2 men in a certain city, the one rich and the other poor. The rich man had very many flocks and herds, but the poor man had nothing but one little ewe lamb which he had bought. He brought it up, and it grew up with him and with his children. It used to eat of his meager fare and drink from his cup and lie in his bosom, and it was like a daughter to him. Now there came a traveler to the rich man, and he was loath to take one of his own flock or herd to prepare for the wayfarer who had come to him, but he took the poor man's lamb and prepared that for the guest who had come to him." Then David's anger was greatly kindled against the man. He said to Nathan, "As the Lord lives, the man who has done this thing deserves to die. He shall restore the lamb 4-fold because he did this thing and because he had no pity." Nathan said to David, "You are the man. Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, I anointed you king over Israel, and I rescued you from the hand of Saul. I gave you your master's house and your master's wives into your bosom, and gave you the house of Israel and of Judah. And if that had been too little, I would have added as much more. Why have you despised the word of the Lord to do what is evil in his sight? You have struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword, and have taken his wife to be your wife, and have killed him with the sword of the Ammonites. Now therefore the sword shall never depart from your house, for you have despised me, and have taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your wife. Thus says the Lord, I will raise up trouble against you from within your own house, and I will take your wives before your eyes and give them to your neighbor, and he shall lie with your wives in the sight of this very sun. For you did it secretly, but I will do this thing before all Israel and before the sun." David said to Nathan, "I have sinned against the Lord." Nathan said to David, "Now the Lord has put away your sin. You shall not die." The word of the Lord. Now may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be always acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Well, the opening sets the tone, doesn't it? It's springtime, the time when kings go out to battle. But David, the warrior, sits this one out. The hero of the duel with Goliath decides he'd rather stay home than go out and fight the enemies that he was made king to confront. He's taking naps, he's walking in the royal roof garden, and one day when he's doing that, he looks across and sees Bathsheba taking a bath on the roof, not very far away, apparently, because he can make her out quite clearly. He sends and finds out that she is the wife of Uriah the Hittite. Now, Uriah the Hittite was one of David's elite warriors. He was part of the sort of the best of David's army, something like a Navy SEAL. So he's the one who's out fighting on a mission, and his wife is home bathing on the roof in clear sight of the royal palace. Bathsheba comes to David, and apparently on that first encounter, they get straight to having sex. Well, are they matched to each other? Bathsheba bathing next to the king's house? I mean, did she know? Apparently David was out there a lot. It couldn't have been that far away. Did she think that she wouldn't be seen? And when he sent for her, could she have said, I'm sorry, my husband is away serving in the army, in the war. I really think I'd better stay home. Now, Bathsheba seems to raise no objection to the overtures from the king. And the story quickly jumps over some weeks until Bathsheba knows that she is pregnant. Did they keep up their relationship in the meantime? Story doesn't tell us, but David has a plan to deal with the problem pregnancy. He's going to bring back Uriah. He'll arrange for Uriah to have sex with his beautiful wife, Bathsheba, and then the baby can be said to be his. Is Bathsheba in on this deception? Hard to think that she's not, but on we go. Uriah is a hero. Uriah will not be comfortable at home while his colleagues are out roughing it on campaign. They're on the front lines. They're living out in the open. He's not going to go home and have a break with his wife. He says, no, this is dishonorable. He would not do this. David makes every effort to cover up the mess that he and Bathsheba have made, but Uriah stays faithful to his principles, to his colleagues, and even to Joab, his commander. David entrusts Uriah with the message to Joab, which is his own death sentence. And Joab carries it out, just like David asked, sending Uriah on a mission to his certain death. And when David, still safe and comfortable in his palace, hears of the casualties, not just Uriah, but many of his unit, the king shrugs philosophically and says, in effect, oh, in war these things happen. It's a shame, but there it is. Tell Joab, he instructs the messenger, that he's really doing a good job. Well, that's the end of the first act of this story. The second act begins with Bathsheba making lamentation for her dead husband. I wonder what's going through her head. Does she now contrast Uriah with David? Has the thrill of being the king's mistress worn off a little bit at this point, and she begins to see the enormity of what she and David have done, especially now that Uriah is dead? Uriah, the strong and distinguished warrior husband that she had? But she doesn't have a lot of alternative, does she? She's a woman without any means of support at this point, and about to be a single mom, and who knows what that would lead to. Now, she could have said, with Uriah dead, that the baby was Uriah's, her dead husband's. It would be a posthumous baby. Such things happen. And no one but David would have known that it was not true. But instead, she opts to go and become the king's wife. Now, I wonder how she feels about David at this point. David already has one wife who holds him in contempt, Micah, who was the daughter of Saul, and I wonder if Bathsheba, even at the beginning of their official marriage, is already beginning to see that David is not the heroic figure that everyone had acclaimed him to be, but he is something else. Even before we hear from Nathan, the costs of David's actions to him and to everyone involved seem high. Uriah, Bathsheba, Joab, and David himself, all of them have been hurt, in one case killed, by what David has done and what Bathsheba has done with him. And it turns out that the child, too, is to become a casualty of this story. Well, the Game of Thrones has nothing on this 3,000-year-old story, does it? I mean, we've got sex, we've got violence, we've got a royal palace, we've got all sorts of deception and darkness and a naked bathing scene. This is a story 3,000 years old, and we think we're being so radical and modern in what we put on TV today. Well, but then we get on to the second part, really, the bulk of the second part of this story, where the text says, the thing that David had done displeased the Lord. There's another character in this story, besides all the ones we've named, and that's the Lord. And God sends Nathan, whom we saw a few weeks before, who was the one who told David, don't build the temple quite yet. This is not what God wants. God sends Nathan, And the fact is, Nathan, look at what Nathan's position is at this point. Would you want to be Nathan with this word from God saying what David has done has displeased me, and now you go tell him? You know, Nathan could have denounced David in a rage, say, you scumbag, you horrible person. Look what you've done. You're an adulterer. You're a murderer. You're unfit to be king. He could have just really hit him right across the head with this. He could have denounced him in a rage. He could have disclosed the secrets around Jerusalem. David could have leaked the news. Hey, you know what? Uriah's death, it wasn't what it looked to be. It was a conspiracy what took place between David and Joab, which ended up with Uriah being dead. Conspiracy theories, can prosper. He could have instigated a palace coup. He could have gone to some people who would very much like to be king and say, David no longer has the Lord's blessing. Remember what happened to Saul when God took his blessing away from him? Well, now David is in the same position Saul was, and we know what happened to him. So, wouldn't you really like to be the king's anointed, the Lord's anointed, and be king? Some Old Testament version of impeachment, saying, you're not qualified. Got to get rid of him. Instead, and the chances are none of those things would have worked, or would have been highly risky if they tried them. Instead, Nathan tells David a story. Now, note how this is a story within a story. It's a little like, the 1001 Nights, the Arabian Nights, which is story within story within story. Well, this is a story within a story. And it's the story of the poor man and his love for his lamb. Remember, David was a shepherd. And his job as a kid was taking care of lambs. So he probably has some sort of deep, association and memory for taking care of lambs when he was a kid and probably not allowed to do anything else. He probably was allowed to take care of lambs. So the rich man comes along and sees the poor man's lamb and doesn't want to take one of his own lambs to feed the stranger who comes to him. In an Oriental hospitality, you throw a big feast for someone who comes as part of what you do. So he takes the poor man's lamb and says, I'm going to kill this one and prepare it. And that's what he does. He uses his social and his economic power to get what he wants and completely ignores what's going on in the heart and the mind of the poor man. David is outraged. David says, how dare he? And then he says, that man deserves to die, or at the very least, fourfold a restitution. Then Nathan drops his bomb. Nathan says, hey, you know what, David? You are that man. You're the man that did this. And then he goes on and recounts all the blessings that David has received. David's no self-made man, but is the recipient of just a whole series of unearned blessings and grace from God. And Nathan reminds him of that. David, who had begun to sort of settle into being the king and thinking that he sort of earned this, he deserved this, he was better than everybody. And Nathan says, no, you're not. Look at this has all been given to you. You didn't earn any of this. And then Nathan concludes with a curse, the consequences of David's actions. He doesn't just say, let's walk away from this, but the fact that you confess means it's okay. He says, no, there are consequences to what you've done. It's kind of like in the New Testament, when we hear the phrase, live by the sword, die by the sword. Or, in the modern sort of parlance, what goes around comes around. What David has done is going to come back and get him as well. Well, let the punishment fit the crime, may be another way to think about this. And the punishment will include sexual humiliation. David's family will be a source of danger, not a source of refuge or safety. And there will be public shame and political disaster attached to what's going to come down the road. David says, I have sinned against the Lord. Interesting. He doesn't say I've sinned against Bathsheba, or I've sinned against Uriah, or even I've sinned against Joab and the army. He said, I've sinned, and all those things could certainly be true. He says, I've sinned against the Lord. Whatever he may have done against Uriah and Bathsheba, he realizes that the deepest sin of his is that he has turned his back on the one who has guided him his entire life. Nathan at that point says, "The Lord has put away your sin." It's not unqualified forgiveness. He says, okay, you won't get, it's kind of like, you won't get the death penalty. You won't die for this. But the other things that Nathan predicted are still going to happen. David does not get off scot-free. What Nathan predicts does indeed come to pass. David survives, but he's wounded. It's a little like Jacob after wrestling with the angel. He walks away, but he's limping. Now, for those of you who haven't read your Old Testament recently, looking ahead quickly, we'll hear more about this next week. David's son Absalom, whom David spoils, and David turns a blind eye to all the things that Absalom has done wrong, like that's never happened since then. And Absalom is corrupt and self-serving, and Absalom seeks to overthrow his father. And David has to flee for his life. Eventually, he is restored. He comes back. Absalom is killed in the process, and David is both destroyed, that he has lost his son, at the same time when he is restored to being the king. It's not exactly a satisfactory conclusion for him. There was no good option for him at that point. And, well, what about the child of the illicit union between David and Bathsheba? Well, the story says the child dies in infancy, not long after he's born. Or does he? Now, the reason I ask that question is, and now we're going to step out of the story a little bit and look at the mechanics of this. Solomon, who later becomes king after David, his famous successor, Solomon is the son of Bathsheba and David. And there are those who think that whoever was putting this story together was not quite comfortable letting the idea that the king was the bastard son of an adulterous relationship involving murder and conspiracy. So they wanted to wipe that kid off the story, off the page, and then say, well, and then they got married and had a regular life and had a baby. Who was Solomon? And so he's king, and no clouds over him because the other baby died. Well, maybe it happened that way. The story, for some reason, there's so much that reminds me of sort of English history in this story. This part reminds me of Elizabeth I, Queen Elizabeth, who is the daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, which is kind of like being the child of Vladimir Putin and one of the Kardashians. It's not exactly the sort of heritage that you'd want to claim, and it wouldn't necessarily promise very much, but she turned out to be quite a successful monarch. And Solomon, we'll hear more about him in a moment, Solomon at least initially looked pretty good. Solomon becomes king, and so I wonder if part of the sort of the royal storytelling, and there's some evidence that this was written long after the fact, wanted to clean up the story so that he is not the son of adultery and murder, but of a less tainted, legitimate subsequent marriage. Well, now, what would it mean for Israel if he really was the son of that first encounter? What would it mean if their king was the son of an extramarital, homicidal union involving a conspiracy? Just think about that for a moment. Well, largely through the machinations of Bathsheba when she's much older, Solomon does indeed end up as David's successor on the throne. It's a close-run thing. There are a number of contenders to be David's successor, but Bathsheba pulls it off. Solomon goes on to be something like an Oriental emperor. He has 600 wives, and I think something like 300 concubines. He builds the temple, and he builds imperial buildings, but at a crushingly great cost to the ordinary people. He lays the sort of the groundwork for what becomes major civil upheaval in another generation. He certainly doesn't go out and fight his enemies. He stays in the palace and receives the Queen of Sheba, Solomon's son is even more entitled and privileged, not to say spoiled, And as a result of that, when he tries to sort of increase taxes again, 10 of the 12 tribes of Israel, the northern tribes, rebel and successfully break away, destroying the integrity of the kingdom and setting the stage for both north and south to fall to invaders, and the very few survivors of those invasions go into exile as slaves. The 10 tribes of the north disappear as an entity. The tribes of Judah survive, hence we get the term Jew. They come back to Jerusalem and become just a shadowy remnant of what had been there before. The house of David ends up as a ruin. Well, some questions before we go into the analysis. How do we know this story? I mean, it's not like there was someone sitting on in the sideline with a sort of tablet taking notes and writing all this down. So who wrote this? And even more interesting, why was it left in? The Bible was probably edited during the Babylonian exile, centuries, maybe 4 centuries or so after this story took place. It's an embarrassing story. They could have just discreetly left it out, say, look, we want to hold up David and have him be the ideal king. Let's not tell some of these stories, which we all know, but are best left sort of, in the side, on the cutting room floor. Why is it left in? Who wrote it? And how do we know this story? Some of it must have been oral tradition. Did Nathan tell somebody? Did David tell somebody? Did Bathsheba? Who knows? Somebody told somebody about this. And then it was written down. And the fact that inside the story, a couple of times they refer to Judah and Israel as if they were different parts of the nation. That doesn't happen until the rebellion against Solomon's son, which makes me think that this came long after that had happened, and that they are using this story in part to justify the rebellion and say this wasn't going against the Lord's anointed, but somehow the rebellion and the successful breaking of Israel, the civil war, was carrying out God's punishment on the house of David for what David had done. Well, we don't know, but that's my speculation. What are the takeaways from this? Well, in an election year, it's tempting to sort of, go to certain issues, but I think election year or not, let's look at what the story says. The personal behavior of leaders has public consequences. There's no such thing as a private matter for leaders, and the public consequences for Israel result from David's character, which this story reveals. And it's not just a single sexual encounter. It's David's character. Look at some of the signs of that. What's happened to that? David doesn't go out with the army. Kings are supposed to go out and fight. That's why they're kings. They go out and fight and lead their soldiers in battle. David made his name as a great soldier. He was incredibly successful from his encounter with Goliath further on. This time, he's staying home, taking naps, and walking on his roof garden. He knew Bathsheba was married before he sent for her. He knew that she was the wife of Uriah the Hittite, one of his distinguished soldiers. He goes, oops, not going to mess with her. There are plenty of other nice girls around. If my eye is wandering, I'm not going to go hard to her. He doesn't observe that. He knew she was married before he sent for her, and he knew she was married to one of his most dedicated and gifted soldiers, someone who literally was willing to lay down his life for David and David's empire. Then, when things went bad, he sought to deny the consequences of his affair with a cover-up. As we have heard in other settings, it's not the crime that gets you, it's the cover-up. Here's another example of that. 3,000 years before Watergate, maybe if Richard Nixon had paid attention, he might have learned a little from this. And then when the cover-up fails, he sacrifices a soldier to keep his own secret. Look at what his priorities have become. An embarrassment to the king, matters more than the life of a man, and not just any man, but a man who is a distinguished soldier for the whole nation. The murder of Uriah also, and this is maybe a footnote, but it also implicates and corrupts Joab. It makes Joab a partner in this. Joab is the commanding general of the army. Do you want your general to be somebody who sort of throws away the lives of one of his distinguished soldiers because of a whim of the king? Well, David apparently did, but look at the consequences. And we'll hear more about Joab later on as we go. A nation ruled by such a man would not prosper. David fulfills Samuel's predictions back in 1 Samuel when the people first say they want a king, and Samuel says, you don't want a king. Look at all the bad things a king is going to do. And the people sit north say, oh no, everyone else has got a king. We want a king. And David actually fulfills pretty much what Samuel had predicted, and what David doesn't fulfill, Solomon and his son do. The issue is all people are subject to evil, not just David. It's not that David is particularly bad. David is a person who has been corrupted by power. Again, going back to English history, it reminds me of Henry VIII. Henry VIII as a young man was the model Renaissance prince. He was trim, athletic, smart. He composed music. He was dashing. He was even, a romantic and good husband to his older wife. He was a good guy. That's how he was as a young man. By the time he reaches middle age, he has become a monster and a tyrant. Absolute power corrupted him absolutely. So as we think about sort of public life and government, perhaps one of the takeaways from this is that entrusting a man or a woman with unchecked power is dangerous, because people will eventually be self-serving. The founders of our country understood that and carefully tried to set up balance of power, so that if someone got out of line, another branch of the government would step in and sort of keep them from getting too far on their own agenda. Whether that balance of power has so successfully survived in the intervening years is a question we could think about and talk about some other time. But the intent was not that people are going to be good, but that people are going to be bad. So how can we manage that if we can set up a system that will have some checks and balances? Well, that's one takeaway. Another takeaway is the power of stories. Nathan tells a parable which accomplishes what a denunciation never would have achieved. Perhaps it means he saw in David a remnant of decency. A parable to somebody with no ability to empathize with the underdog and no sense of justice, a parable to someone like that would be completely wasted and lost. But David rose to the occasion. Nathan's story adroitly pulls David out of his self-defensive mode, and David actually transcends self-interest. Back when the Episcopal Church started losing million-dollar lawsuits for sexual misconduct, they set up a system of clergy training. We all had to go mandatory training, so we would be trained out of doing evil. Like, that's going to work. But one of the useful things I learned in this training was something which people call the exception fallacy. The exception fallacy is, I know this is wrong, but this case is different. It's, for anybody else it would be wrong, but we really love each other, so it's all right. Or, I know I shouldn't be involved with this person, but he or she is really needy and I can really be helpful to them. And in the long run, this will be good for them, even though, on the textbook case, it's not really allowed. That's the exception fantasy. How people rationalize for themselves what they know to be evil, and yet still go ahead and do, which is why, trying to train people out of behaving that way seems like a sort of self-referential sort of, act of folly. But I learned that, and that was, interesting. And I think David has the exception fallacy. And the parable goes around that and says, what do you think about the person who acts like this? And David said, it's absolutely outrageous. And then Nathan says, but you are the man. Well, the power of stories. They're parables, like we hear. Also, think about looking back in our history, Uncle Tom's Cabin. Abraham Lincoln said that was the thing that started the whole war. Uncle Tom's Cabin, a story. Roots in our own age was a way of saying, imagine what it would be like to grow up in Africa and to be enslaved and brought to this country and then have to live a life as a slave of somebody else. Roots did that. The autobiography of Malcolm X, another story, which gets people inside the head of someone that a lot of people would not think as someone they'd want to identify with. But when you read the story, you sort of say, oh, well, this makes sense. Or Ralph Ellison's novel, Invisible Man, which does a similar tale of what it's like to grow up as a black man in mid-20th century America. Stories are very powerful in terms of getting around all of our defenses, saying, well, just consider for a moment what this might be like. The story develops the ability to think outside of the self. Education, which turns away from stories and puts in their place the study of theories, I think, is really losing a powerful resource and producing young people who are not fully equipped to deal with the complexity of the life that they will face. Stories tend to be from the ages. We go back, this story goes back 3,000 years. Not a whole lot of political theory goes back that far. Theories that we teach tend to be from this decade or maybe the last couple of decades or at the most this generation. Not a whole lot of theories that we teach go back much further than we are. So stories, in many ways, transcend the limits of our own experience in a way that our theories and social science often does not. And the Bible has lots of stories. Consider two parts of the Bible. The Good Samaritan versus the Epistle of the Romans. Theologians love the Epistle of the Romans. Most people could not begin to tell you what the Epistle of the Romans is about. The Good Samaritan, a lot of people could tell you that story, and it's powerful. The prodigal son, same thing. People know the story. Jesus told stories when he wanted to teach. He did not harangue people so much as to tell stories. And those are the things which even as children we learn and still get. Consider some of these other stories. Noah's Ark, David and Goliath, Samson and Delilah, Jonah and the whale, the Garden of Eden, the Tower of Babel. They're all from the Old Testament. They're multi-level engagements with meaning. You can read them at a childish level, but when you get older, you can read them at a different level, and they have further resonance. Noah's Ark, wonderful story about animals going into a boat. Step back, and it's a story of the environmental consequences of bad behavior. And in Noah's Ark, everybody dies except for Noah and his family. It's not like some people survive because they're good people and they tried to resist all the bad things going on. There are society-wide consequences to bad behavior, and it's not just singling out the people who've sinned and punishing them and everyone else gets off. Noah's Ark is a complicated story, and not one which is explored very much in the church these days. And in fact, the lectionary editors never include it on Sunday morning. Well, is there anything offensively narrow-minded in the David and Bathsheba story? Is there any reason why this story should not be widely read, discussed, and debated? When we lose the Bible from our public discourse, look at what we lose. Ignoring God, for us, as it proved to be for David, might turn out to be not so much a religious issue as a national one. That may be another takeaway from this story. Thank you for sharing in this reflection.